going. All right, so welcome all to the final session of today for Gugum. We've got 2 more days ahead of us. We've had a good one today already, and to finish off the day, we've got Martin Patrick, who is the systems librarian at Georgia Tech, and he will be discussing thinking about design thinking during a migration. And I'll just go ahead and hand it over to him. And Martin, take it away.
All right, thanks, Sean. Thank you, everybody, for choosing to spend your 3 o'clock hour with us today. I don't think I'm going to take the full hour. As Sean said, I'm the systems librarian at Georgia Tech. Yes, I am new. I started in September in this role. Previously, I was at the University of Minnesota, and before that, at St. Olaf and Carleton colleges, which is also in Minnesota. So I've been through, I call 1.5 library system migrations. The most recent one was at St. Olaf and Carleton when we migrated from Millennium to Alma. And before that, a long time ago, when I was at Miami University in Ohio, we migrated from Millennium to Sierra. And so I call that a half migration because Sierra was ostensibly an upgrade over Millennium, and there were some changes, but mostly it was a facelift. So that's my 1.5 system migrations to date. So about this presentation today, it's really, I know most of us are used to library presentations really kind of being, look at this cool thing I did, but this presentation is really more of a what if we did some cool things kind of presentation. And I want to talk about designing for staff today. So I'm going to use the word staff to mean people who work within Alma or Folio, as the case may be. So this is administrators, it's librarians, it's people in non-MLIS required positions, it's student workers, temporary employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to kind of extract some ideas from the larger conversations around design thinking and think about how those can be applied to things that are happening during a migration. And my point isn't that we should all run off and enroll at Stanford's design school and become, designers. But I think that there are some things that we can do to be more intentional about how we design things during the migration. So I'm going to be talking about what is design thinking, what is enterprise design thinking, which is a bit of a response from IBM in terms of how you can apply it at a larger organization or an organization like a library that has a lot of inertia and change kind of happens a little slowly. Who we're designing for and what we're actually designing. So the origins of design thinking can be traced back into the 60s and 70s or so, into the 80s, when people started to think about design as a way to actually solve problems and less of a way to create things. And the term itself, design thinking, sort of took off in the 90s. Mostly because of a firm called Ideate, IDEO, which popularized this approach and started to emphasize it in a wider range of industries. So one of the main founders of that was a guy named David Kelly, who was a professor at Stanford and had run his own design firm out in Silicon Valley for a long time. You may have heard of him before, mostly because his design firm is the firm that designed the original Apple mouse, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And I know that's a whole thing. Yes, Apple probably stole it directly from Xerox, but we're going to talk about what actually went into designing the Apple mouse. And while we might think that the original Apple mouse, which I'll show you in a second, looks clunky compared to what we're used to today, Ideate claims that this design forms the basis for almost every mouse that is out there on the market today. So according to the proponents of design thinking, it was developed to counter traditional problem-solving methods, which were often linear, focused on analysis and data and top-down decision-making. Design thinking instead emphasizes an approach that's centered on the user, that's iterative, and that's experimental and relies on prototypes more than a final product. So some of the underlying principles of design thinking are really obvious, I think, to us these days: empathy, collaboration, iteration, We all do these things. There's nothing necessarily magical about design thinking per se, other than the fact that there is a bit of a mindset to it that's designed to foster creativity, and kind of be more collaborative between the business needs and the user's needs. So let's look at the mouse situation. So on your left, you can see the original Xerox mouse. And on the right, you can see the Apple mouse that was originally released with, gosh, I don't know if it was the Lisa or the Macintosh, but one of those. So they don't look a whole lot different on their face. The key difference, though, there are two key differences. The first, the Xerox mouse cost about $300 to make, and the Apple mouse cost about $15. So that, seems like a lot of money, but that's in 1970 whatever dollars, right? So if we put it in today's dollars, that's actually a difference of $1,200 to make versus $60. So that's a pretty substantial difference in design. And of course, if you've ever used an Apple computer before, you'll recognize that there is one button, whereas the Xerox has 3 buttons. But remember, at the time, no one had ever, the mouse wasn't a thing, right? Like in the late 70s and early 80s, people didn't have PCs by and large. No one interacted with computers using a mouse. This was brand new to most people. And so, one of the things that the Ideate, well, it wasn't the Ideate firm, it was David Kelly's design firm, focused on was designing a mouse that people could literally just pick up and use, right? If there's just one button, all you have to do is click the one button. With the Xerox mouse, like what do each of those buttons do? Is it like piano pedals? Is it like the gas, the brake, and the clutch in the car? Like what exactly is going on with those 3 buttons? So the Apple mouse came out, and it's really about designing something that is both economical to produce and scale, and also something that people can use without a user manual. So if we think back to a classic 80s movie, we remember that Scotty doesn't know how to use a mouse, right? He picks it up and tries to talk to the computer with it, thinking it's some sort of microphone device. So, this is a joke now, but back then that was kind of a real thing. Even in the mid 80s, a lot of people still hadn't ever interacted with a computer, let alone a mouse. So moving on to kind of the main features of design thinking. Basically, it's a way to prioritize the needs and experiences of users at the end of the day. So the main principles are empathy, definition of the solution, ideation, prototyping, and testing. Empathy is simply understanding needs, wants, fears, whatever of users to form the basis of the design process, right? So think about the Apple mouse. Users probably, since they've never used one before, wanted something simple because they've never used one. So it makes it really easy to pick it up and go. You drag it around, the cursor moves, you click on things with one button. Defining a clear definition, everything is always better served by a clear definition. The clear definition of the Apple mouse is a mouse that's much cheaper to build and also more durable. That was part of the design, was the kind of rib cage design, and you'll still find that in mice today. And that would be easy for users to navigate around. So then you ideate, and this is just brainstorming, the best kind of brainstorming, not just sitting in a room throwing out ideas, but all kinds of various processes that you can use, mind mapping, writing things down on Post-its and putting it up on the board, all of that kind of stuff without judging or evaluating ideas. And then you move into prototyping. And this is simply creating kind of low fidelity prototypes of promising solutions that you can test and get feedback on as quickly as you can. So if you've ever done any kind of UX testing in libraries for like your Discovery service or whatever, you may have created a slide that's a static image of what it could look like and shown that to users and gotten their feedback. That's a prototype. So it doesn't have to be like a working copy of something. It just needs to be something that you can show to people to get feedback on. And then testing is simply gathering feedback from users and refining your prototype until you can get to sort of a ideal solution. Some other things that go into this iteration, right? You can move back and forth across any of these stages. It doesn't have to go in order. I shouldn't have put it in order. I don't know why I did that. I'm just so old-fashioned at my thinking, I guess. Collaboration is also really important. And then, of course, user-centeredness. The whole point is that the design process comes out of what users need. And that main premise of traditional design thinking is going to be a sticking point when we start talking about enterprise design thinking. So I kind of group these things together. The empathy and definition stage kind of go hand in hand together. In order to empathize, you can do observation, you can do, like ethnography, you can do interviews, focus groups, you can watch people over their shoulder as they move through a computer system or whatever it is that you're trying to design for. The idea is you want to really get in there and understand what users are doing and also how they're feeling about it, what they're thinking, what are the roadblocks, what's getting in the way. And the defining that is trying to take all of that data that you've gathered and turn that into something usable that you can say, this is probably where we need to go with our prototyping. So then you move into the ideation stage, and that's where you take all of the stuff from the empathy and definition stage and start to really dig in with brainstorming. Like I said, there's all kinds of approaches to brainstorming out there. Some are better than others. The classic sitting in a room shouting ideas is one of the worst ways that you can actually brainstorm, according to the research. And the whole point is with design thinking, traditional, quote unquote, traditional design thinking is to be as novel as possible. The whole point is to come up with something new, outside the box. You want to ideally start without a conception of where you're trying to go, really. You don't want to start with the end in mind. You want to let your off-the-wall ideas get you to the end. So a classic example of this is you ask people to design a vase. So when you say design a vase, everybody instantly, immediately thinks, okay, it's a cylindrical thing that's, probably tapered at the bottom. It might have a few holes in it so water can drain out. But if you ask people to design a way to enjoy flowers inside their home, that's a whole different question and opens up a whole different realm of possible solutions. Yes, a vase falls in that category, but there are tons and tons of ideas that you could come up with from that question instead. And that's really what design thinking is trying to get at, is just trying to find a new way to do things, because the way that it's always been done may not necessarily be the best. But like the Xerox mouse and the Apple mouse, ultimately it came back to the same form in the end. It was just slightly different. So it can go either way. And then lastly, you do a lot of prototyping and testing. Again, prototypes can be simple mock-ups on a page, wireframes, but depending on what you're trying to build, it could be a 3D printed model, it could be a working robot, whatever it is. You want to have something that helps the user understand what you're building, but it doesn't have to be complete yet. And then you take the prototype and you test it, and you go through a lot of observation and interviewing and talking about it. And then you refine the prototype, you test it some more, you do some more refinements, you test it some more. And ultimately what you're trying to do is make sure that the outcome meets the needs, the fears, the desires of the users, rather than the needs, wants, fears, desires of the builders. And I think that's one of the key distinctions there. So that's all well and good. However, IBM, who you may have heard of, comes along and says, well, that's great, but we don't think we can really use this in a huge organization like us. We are massive. Traditional design thinking happens in design firms with just a few people. We're talking about tens of thousands of employees all over the world. So, we have some concerns that basic traditional design thinking isn't going to scale to an organization like ours. We don't think that design thinking is focused enough on the business needs here. We think that we need to find a balance between business needs and users' needs. While still trying to prioritize the user needs, we do need to keep in mind business needs. Because while the solution may be brand new and novel, we can't afford to make it. So, Xerox's mouse was brand new. Like no one had ever seen that before. That was out of the blue. No one had seen it, but it cost $300 a unit to make. Like no one can scale that. Can you imagine trying to replace your mouse if you had to go to Best Buy and drop $1,200 on it today? And then lastly, another problem is measuring impact. So, design thinking, because it's new, it can really be challenging, or because the emphasis is on creating something new more than it is anything else. Like it can be challenging to understand the impact of that. And so IBM wants to come up with a way to practice design thinking in a large organization that can scale, that focuses on business needs, and that also allows one to measure impact more successfully. So, you think back to the concept of coming up with a way to enjoy flowers indoors that's not a vase. You could come up with something that's beautiful, but it could be too big to fit in a house. It could be too expensive to make. So if you think about that in the terms of a organization like IBM, it's too expensive to make. We don't have the supplies for it. We can't ship it because it's too fragile, even though it's beautiful. And so IBM wants to find that balance. So they came up with kind of a framework that they call the loop. So their vocabulary is observe, reflect, and make. And like I said, they've tried to build this that's specifically tailored to large organizations or organizations that traditionally don't change quickly, or that traditionally don't have a lot of change happening in the first place. I like the idea of the loop, right? You can move around between the different aspects of it, just like design thinking. You're supposed to move around back and forth. You're not supposed to go linearly. So that's IBM's language. If you recall, traditional design language generally tends to fall around empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. IDEO, the design firm I mentioned earlier, calls their process inspire, evolve, and validate. I personally really like IBM's choice of words here, especially the word reflect. I think reflect is such a crucial word for everything. Ideation is great. Generating tons of new ideas is great. But you've got to take that beat. You got to take the stop and just reflect on what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish. And I think ideation and reflection go hand in hand, but I don't think you can simply throw ideas out and just run with them because they're new. You need to reflect on, are they scalable? Can we actually do this? Rather than, oh, isn't this beautiful and new? So within the loop, they have these other three things that they call hills, playbacks, and sponsor users. So hills are the definition based on the user outcomes that are trying to achieve, and it's focused on user outcomes and not functions and features. So it's not a list of functions or functional requirements or whatever you want to say. It's more of a user outcome. It's more of an agile story, if you will. Playbacks are where you do a lot of the collaboration with the user. You start to show the prototype. You start to show how the prototype connects to the hill and the story that the user is experiencing from the user's perspective. And then lastly, the sponsor users. So sponsor users are, I think, a really cool idea that has come out of this. It's real world users, somebody who's using the product, somebody who might use the product. And they're involved from the process, from the beginning to the end. They regularly meet with the design team to give feedback. They are currently using the product in a lot of cases. And so they, have immediate reactions to things. They know the product backwards and forwards already that you're trying to improve, or if it's a new product, they're doing something similar. So for instance, sponsor users for internal users of Folio would be people who are already working in Alma doing tasks in that. So we would be, these people are experts at the general and specific processes that Alma has. And so as a sponsor user, they would work together with systems folk, EBSCO folks, and, go through this process together from the beginning to the end, not as just someone who stops by for a 45-minute scripted user experience test, but constantly and continuously giving feedback. So just a little bit more about these concepts. So IBM has a preferred format for how hills are structured. They call it the who, what, and wow factor. The chief example that they like to use is President Kennedy's speech announcing the intention to land on the moon. And the reason they like that so much is because a good hill, in their opinion, should be about where you're going and not how to get there. So the idea is to be implementation agnostic as much as possible. And you want to have both clarity and flexibility in how this looks. So to quote President Kennedy, or to slightly adapt it, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a person on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. So this is a really good who, what, wow, right? So the who is the person, the what is landing that person on the moon, and the wow is returning them safely back to Earth. If you think back to the early 1960s and the space race, we were really good at shooting people into space and bringing them back. But no one knew if it was possible to send someone all the way to the moon and then also bring them back. Like, I think there was a lot of thought that we could put someone on the moon, but it would probably be the last thing that they would do. And so the wow factor is actually, bringing them back to Earth. And of course, it's implementation agnostic because it doesn't say how we bring that person back to Earth, right? It ended up that the return vehicle was part of the whole rocket and went with them to the moon. But it could have been something where the person went to the moon and waited while the next vehicle came to pick them up. So who, what, wow, implementation agnostic. It's clear we're going to put somebody on the moon and we're going to bring them home, but it's flexible because it doesn't say exactly what that looks like. And so that gives NASA then the space to come up with the outcome that we did. And yes, the moon landing happened. Don't at me. So the playback is just a time for the design team and the stakeholders or the sponsor users to share stories and hills, reflect on them together, demos, wireframes, mock-ups, 3D printed things, whatever, just to get as much feedback as possible. IBM's method says that they err on the side of being too inclusive, but ultimately, for them, the key is the story and not like the requirements or technical specifications. That can be worked out later. The key is the story. And I think that's really cool, right? Because we're supposed to be user-centered, human-centered, and humans really thrive on stories and telling stories. And so by being able to turn the design process on stories, I think is just really powerful. And then lastly, sponsor users. Again, I think these are really important. I think this is a really cool idea. And because these are real people, it's not just an abstraction that the design team has made up. It's a real person. You can ask them anytime for feedback or clarification. And they help you sort of see things from a new perspective, and we help them see things from a new perspective. And by staying in touch with real users from the get-go, you can make sure that you aren't creating something that's overcomplicated, that you're actually creating something that's useful and intuitive, that's easy to use. So I think this is one of the key things that I pull out from this whole thing called enterprise design thinking. And really, at the end of the day, centering the user is really what everybody's trying to do here. Whether it's design thinking, enterprise design thinking, universal design for learning, whatever, it's really about prioritizing the needs of a real user, but also structuring work in a meaningful way to produce a usable outcome. So as I mentioned before, there are really kind of two users of library software. There's the public, whether you want to call them the patrons, the end users, whatever you want to call them. I found this really old screenshot from Chelmsford Public Library, wherever that is in old school Mozilla. So, that's one group of users that we have. The other group of users are staff. So here's a great screenshot of Northwestern's Catalogers Toolkit. I don't know if anybody's ever used it before, but internal users are users too, right? Those are faculty, staff, administrators, student workers, whoever's working in Alma, whoever's working in Folio, working in the back end of Primo, whatever. I call these internal users or staff, as I said before. We did, when I was on Millennium a long time ago, we did have something that looked like this. I think this ran maybe on Voyager. I don't know, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But like, just, what are the colors? What are these colors doing? What do these things mean? What does the Q button do? What does the C button do? Like, I don't, from a user perspective, I don't understand what's happening here. This is not intuitive. It's really ugly. And it doesn't make any sense to me. So as I mentioned in my, yes, thank you, Julie. As I mentioned in my abstract, like, I did a quick search. This is not, dissertation level research here. But I did a quick search for user experience in libraries in Lista. And I sorted them by publication recency and started going through them to see if anybody was talking about internal user experience, staff users, people working in Alma or, whatever. And I found it took me 55 results before I got to one that was talking about an intranet that someone was building for their staff. So I created this pie chart just as a visualization of how little this was being talked about. And I don't know if this is actually happening and no one's talking about it. I don't know if we feel like, and I certainly do feel like this a little bit, I don't know if we feel like because it's a vendor provided product, it's not necessarily our responsibility to fix their user interface. But I want to ask the question, like, what if we took a more active role? If I took a more active role, if, we can't directly change the user experience, right? Like, obviously, I'm not going to get into Folio and build a user interface on top of it. But what if we still did internal user testing? What if we still took those results and gave them to Ex Libris or gave them to EBSCO and said, here, our staff are really struggling with this. We need you to fix it. So while we don't have a lot of immediate control over the user experience for staff and faculty working within a library services platform, it just seems like we're not really talking about it. And maybe we are. Maybe, if I had kept going, it would be a completely different outcome in terms of going through the results list of my search. I remember when we migrated to Alma at St. Olaf and Carleton, this was 2016, so this was a while ago. We had some pretty big concerns about the number of clicks that it took to do something. And Alma still suffers from this occasionally, but it is vastly better. And that happened because the community pushed back on that. It was really obvious that this was a problem. But there are probably a lot of roadblocks that staff experience on a daily basis that aren't so obvious, and we still need to focus on those and figure them out and bring something to EBSCO or Ex Libris. Okay, so what does it mean, in my opinion, based on what I've said so far, to design for staff? So I'm going to talk about an example. So a while ago, I was approached by a colleague who deals with book donations. And he wants to know if I have this book in front of me or I have this, retired faculty's house full of books in front of me, how can I find out if it's in Alma and OCLC without having to look it up, right? So we want to know, does Georgia Tech already have a copy? Does someone else in USG have a copy? And how many holdings are in OCLC already? Like, can we get it easily without accessioning it to our collection? So, Martin here, I know how to write things in Python. I immediately thought, a Python script. It's perfect. It'll use the Alma API to look it up. It'll use OCLC's APIs to look it up. I'll teach him how to run a Python script from his computer. But he's never used Python before. So is this the best solution? I don't know, but I just immediately went to Python. And I keep thinking about the Catalogers Toolkit from Northwestern. They were solving a problem by creating macros and that kind of thing to do a lot of the work. But it's not a great user experience. And the Python script would be the exact same thing. It would do what it needed to do, but is it intuitive for him to use if he's never launched a Python script before? Am I going to run into a situation where IT won't let him install Python on his computer to run it in the first place? I don't know. I started down this path, and then I realized I really need to take a step back and work with him more closely and sit down and start to brainstorm ideas about what this might look like. Maybe it's a cloud app in Alma. Maybe it's, I don't know, something else. But my point is that I immediately started down this path, but then I reflected and realized that maybe this wasn't the best way to do this. Maybe I needed to take a step back, observe how he does it in the first place, and then reflect on that, ideate through that, maybe build a prototype or two and get his feedback, and just kind of have more of a collaborative conversational approach to building this thing that will help him do his work better. So then, in the sense of designing a migration, as I've called it, I've pulled out some ideas from what I've shared earlier from some of these other approaches to things. So I've pulled out empathy, sponsor users, and the idea of validation. We don't necessarily have a ton of control over the user experience of Alma or Folio itself, but we could build tools that let us interact with it, like the Catalogers Toolkit, that are built specifically for what our users say they need to be able to do. But we also have some control over what's happening during a migration beyond just the software itself, right? We have control over how we communicate information. We have control how we design our staff training programs. We have control over how we structure and store permanent documentation. And so I think focusing on the ideas of empathy, focusing on the user's needs, right? We're writing these things, we're doing these things, we're doing training for the people who are actually going to be doing the work, not ourselves. Speaking as someone who will be doing some of the training, probably, I'm not doing it for myself, I'm doing it for someone else. It needs to be designed for them, not for me. If you've ever tried to learn Python or R and gone into the documentation and immediately gave up, it's because it's not designed for people who haven't used that before. It's designed for people who already know what they're doing. The idea of sponsor users, I think, is really important because, again, you start with a real user and keep them engaged throughout the process as you design and build something, whether it's an email or a whole program to train them. You are working in tandem with the person who's going to experience it and designing it and building it for them. And then I like the word validation too, because it's not simply putting something out there and calling it good. You're coming back to it at some point and you're making sure that it's actually doing what you intend. So I've put together a perspective here on the next slide that I call staff training in the loop. So again, the key is to center the user and to be empathetic to what they need. And so I think thinking about kind of designing a vase versus designing a way to enjoy flowers, shifting the question from what I ask myself, such as how can I create a way for someone to learn this, to how can I create something for them to master the process, right? So I'm creating something for them. I'm not creating it for myself, I'm creating it for them and keeping the focus on them. And I don't know. I don't know what that's going to look like. It may look like traditional training programs. I don't know. This is another place where universal design for learning could come in as well. So here's an example in the who, what, while format, right? An acquisition staff member. The what is mastering the process from ordering to receiving within Folio, and the wow is in less than an hour, right? So it's not just learning the process, it's actually mastering the process. They only need to do the training once and spend less than an hour on it, and boom, they've got it forever. Contrast that with me, the poor systems librarian who wants to give items an end of term due date and can never actually remember how to do that in Alma, even though people keep asking him to do it. So, coming up with a way to create a way for me to learn that so that I actually remember it for the next time. And we don't need to do this for everything. right? Because maybe just teaching acquisitions, creating a way for acquisition staff members to learn to master these processes is enough for them to master other processes. And what we learn from one specific thing, we can apply to other things that we're trying to do as part of the migration overall. So, I mean, really, in conclusion, ultimately, it's about empathy. So design thinking, whether it's classic, enterprise, universal design for learning, whatever other design mindsets or methodologies or frameworks are out there, the key is really to listen in and with our users. As I've said today, I think that while we spend an admirable amount of time focusing on user needs of our patrons, end users, whatever, I think there's room for focusing on internal users, as staff users as well, who have needs regarding the systems that we're using. And while that's largely prescribed by the vendor, and we don't necessarily have a ton of control over it, I want to take a more assertive approach in gathering feedback and pushing vendors on some of these things. And as I said, we do have control over communications, staff training, how we advocate for our staff users. We do have control over some of the stuff that's involved in the migration, even though we don't have total control over everything. So one of my goals, thinking about design thinking during a migration, is to do more of that, to focus on the internal user as much as the external user. And hopefully then, we can contribute to Folio providing a better user interface than Alma does in the end by gathering feedback, pushing EBSCO and the Folio community on it, and sharing it out using some of these principles, but most particularly using empathy. So that's all I have. I have an appendix here with just the abstract in it, and then also I've got some further linking. ACRL has a page about design thinking in academic libraries. I also have a Zotero library I threw together with a bunch of papers I found related to design thinking in libraries. You can access it at this link. Slides will be available at some point later. And so, yeah, that's it. So questions, comments, rebuttals, epithets.
And as with the other sessions, feel free to throw your comments or questions into the chat. Okay, hold up. Yes. Go back into the chataways. All right, so Lucy had a question. So during the RFI, we developed a series of user scenarios and user stories that we asked the vendors to sort of walk through in either their answers or their demos. Would that be considered quote unquote design thinking? Lucy's asking.
I think so. I mean, we had
just wrapping up the end of a session.
We had a sorry, I heard someone talking there. We had a story, right? And EBSCO presented prototypes to us that we looked at. So I think we could argue that that's design thinking. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, Lucy actually has another one here. So what next steps would you consider that we should take as we start planning? I guess
I was hoping that you weren't going to ask that question.
What would Martin do?
What would Martin do? WWMD. I mean, I think realistically, the key is to start I think the first thing I would do would be to start identifying who my sponsor users are going to be. Um, I'm going to pull out. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, so I would want to pull out somebody who, for instance, keeping in line with the acquisitions kind of side of things. I would want to pull out somebody who has a lot of experience in Alma with acquisitions, somebody who doesn't, somebody who's new. Make sure we have somebody from one of the big research universities. We have somebody who's from a smaller school. Yeah, I mean, this is definitely work for the guild committees. It's not really, I mean, unless you want to pay me a lot of money to do this, maybe we can talk. But yeah, I think identifying who the real world sponsor users are going to be, and those are going to form the basis for how all of this stuff starts to happen. That's where I would start. The guild committees could be the sponsor users. I don't, if that's what you're asking, I'm not sure. I'm still new. I don't know how representative they are of, the kind of different levels of experience and expertise that's out there. But yeah, that could be a place to start as sponsor users. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we try to maintain a decent amount of representation on those as best as possible.
Yeah, and IBM would say like you can't err too much on the side of inclusivity. So a lot of people would tend to maybe have a smaller group of like just 3 or 4, but I think a larger group makes sense too. Because it is a big system, right? I mean, there's a lot of people involved here. There's, a lot of different schools, a lot of different environments.
Okay. Well, great. I don't see anything else coming in. Martin, great talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you all for attending the sessions, for those of you that could come to the sessions today, and more tomorrow and Thursday. So we'll see you soon. And these recordings will hopefully be out ASAP. So y'all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Martin. Take care.
All right.